The marble was cold against his knees. Cold in that particular way that seeps through bone and settles somewhere deep, somewhere that aches even when you're not kneeling anymore. Archer had been kneeling on this floor for 3 years, and he had learned that the cold never really leaves. It lives in him now, like a second skeleton made of ice and silence. He was 36 years old, and he had believed, foolishly, desperately, like a man drowning who keeps reaching for a rope that was never there, that if he just tried hard enough, if he was just good enough, quiet enough, small enough, the Vance family would finally stop treating him like a mistake they were too polite to correct. The bucket beside him held gray water. He had scrubbed this same stretch of marble 2 hours ago. The housekeeper had already cleaned it yesterday. The Vance family did not need clean floors. They needed Archer Vance, nay Archer Morrow, on his knees. They needed him low. It was the only place they could tolerate seeing an Omega who had somehow, through some cosmic error, some lapse in the universe's judgment, married into their bloodline. Above him, on the grand staircase, the family had gathered for their morning coffee. "Careful, Archer." The voice floated down like poisoned honey. Catherine Vance, his mother-in-law, had a way of making even the gentlest words sound like a blade being sharpened. "You missed a spot near the door. You always miss that spot. I suppose some people simply weren't raised to notice detail." Laughter followed. Soft, cultured, cruel. His sister-in-law, Camilla, leaned over the banister in a silk robe that cost more than everything Archer had ever owned combined. "Mother, be kind." Not everyone had a mother who taught them how to keep a home. Some of us learn from the help, and some of us are the help. More laughter. Archer's hands stilled on the floor for just a moment. Then he kept scrubbing. He had learned that answering only made it worse. If he cried, they mocked the tears. If he stayed silent, they called him sullen. If he smiled, he had stopped smiling years ago, they would have called him simple. There was no correct answer. There had never been a correct answer. Because the humiliation was not a means to an end. It was the end. It was the point. He looked up the stairs to where his husband stood. Julian Vance, the man he had married for love 3 years ago, in a small chapel by the water, before he understood what family Julian came from, and what that family would do to anyone who didn't belong. Julian was holding his coffee, looking at his phone. The morning light from the tall windows caught the sharp angles of his face. The face Archer had once traced in the dark, thinking, "This is mine. This beautiful man is mine." Julian was an alpha, of course. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of casual, effortless power that came from never having to prove anything to anyone. And he did not look up. He never looked up. That was the part that hollowed Archer out most. Not the cruelty of his mother and sister, but the silence of the man who had promised to stand beside him. The alpha who had claimed him in the old way, in a chapel with candles and flowers and words that Archer had believed with his whole heart. "Julian," Catherine said lightly, "tell your Omega he missed a spot." And Julian, without lifting his eyes from the screen, murmured, "You missed a spot, Archer." The bucket of water in front of Archer rippled with his reflection. A man on his knees. An Omega on his knees. A man who had once had dreams, a small bakery, maybe, or a bookshop by the water, somewhere warm and bright where people came in and smiled and called him by his name. He looked at that reflection and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Not sadness. Something older. Something colder. The very first faint spark of the end of his patience. He did not know it yet. But in less than 1 hour, a car would pull through the gates of the Vance estate, and the man who stepped out of it would change the direction of the rest of his life. Archer Morrow had not always lived like this. He had grown up in a small town 3 hours north, the son of a schoolteacher and a carpenter, in a house that was warm even when it was poor. His mother had baked bread on Sundays and hummed while she did it, her omega scent, warm cinnamon and something like honey, filling the small kitchen. His father had built him a bookshelf when he was 9, a sturdy thing made of pine and love, and told him that a person could go anywhere, be anyone, as long as they kept their dignity and their kindness. Those two things, his father used to say, no one can take from you unless you hand them over. His father had been a beta, steady, reliable, unfailingly kind. He had loved Archer's Omega mother with a devotion that had never wavered, even when her heats grew difficult, even when the scent glands in her neck began to fail in her later years. Archer had grown up surrounded by love, the kind of love that made small houses feel like castles and plain food taste like feasts. Then his parents had died. A car accident on an icy road. 3 weeks before Archer's 20th birthday. He had sold the house, the bookshelves, the warm kitchen with its Sunday morning scent of bread, and had moved to the city to start over. He had nothing but a small inheritance, a head full of recipes, and the bone-deep conviction that if he just kept his back straight and his heart open, the world would eventually be kind. He met Julian at a charity dinner where Archer had been working as a caterer's assistant, carrying trays of little pastries he had helped bake. Julian was handsome. God, he had been so beautiful, all sharp jaw and easy smile and alpha confidence that somehow wasn't arrogance, or at least Archer hadn't recognized it as such. He had followed Archer into the kitchen just to keep talking, his warm alpha scent, cedar and something like rain on stone, filling the small space. For 2 years, Julian had been gentle. He had been funny. He had seemed, Archer thought, like the kind of man his father would have approved of. A man who spoke softly and laughed easily, and looked at Archer like he was the most precious thing in any room. Archer had not known then what the name Vance meant in this city. He had not known that the family fortune had been built on things people whispered about, but never said aloud. He only knew that Julian wanted him, and that being wanted by an alpha like Julian felt like sunlight after a long gray winter. The wedding was small because Julian's family did not attend. Catherine had sent a single line through Julian's assistant. "We do not celebrate mistakes." Archer should have run then. But he was in love, and love makes even intelligent Omegas brave in exactly the wrong direction. For the first year, they lived in an apartment across town, and Archer was happy. He cooked Julian's favorite meals. He made bread on Sundays, just like his mother used to do, filling their small kitchen with warmth and the scent of rising dough. Julian would come home and wrap his arms around Archer from behind, press his nose to Archer's scent gland, and murmur something soft and affectionate against his skin. Then Julian's father died, and everything changed. Julian was pulled back into the family, into the estate, into a world of quiet money and quieter rules. And Archer was pulled in behind him, not as a husband, not as an Omega who had been claimed and cherished, but as an intruder to be managed, corrected, and kept in his place. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of being told his cooking was common. 3 years of Catherine forgetting to set a place for him at family dinners. 3 years of Camilla's little comments about his clothes, his accent, his hands that had worked for a living. 3 years of Julian growing quieter and colder, until the man Archer had married seemed to exist only in old photographs. Archer had stopped baking bread early in the second year. The scent of it seemed to offend Catherine, and Julian had asked him, quietly, apologetically, if he could maybe not. Just for a while. Just until things settled down. Things had not settled down. And in all that time, in all those cold rooms, there was only one thing that had ever frightened the Vance family into silence. The mention of one name. Marcus. Archer had never met him. He only knew that Marcus was Julian's uncle, the older brother of Julian's late father, the true head of the family, the one who had built everything the Vances stood on. He knew that Catherine's voice dropped whenever his name came up. He knew that Julian's father had feared him, that Julian himself went pale and quiet at the mention. He knew that once, years ago, at a rare family gathering, he had heard Camilla whisper the word monster. He had never expected to meet him. But this morning, as Archer knelt on the cold marble with a bucket of gray water, a black car was already turning off the main road, moving smooth and silent toward the great iron gates of the Vance estate. The doorbell rang at 9:30. Catherine frowned from the top of the staircase. "We're not expecting anyone." She snapped her fingers at Archer. "Well, don't just kneel there. Answer the door. Make yourself useful for once." Archer rose slowly, his knees protesting. He had been kneeling for an hour, and the cold had settled deep into his joints. He wiped his wet hands on the apron they made him wear, a thin, humiliating thing that marked him as a servant in his own home, and crossed the enormous foyer. He opened the great front door. A man stood there. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and though he had to be somewhere in his late 50s, there was nothing soft about him. His silver hair was swept back from a face that was all clean lines and hard weather, the kind of face that had seen a great deal and forgiven very little. He wore a charcoal suit, beautifully cut, and a long dark coat that sat on his broad shoulders like a second skin. He carried himself with the absolute stillness of a man who had never once in his life had to hurry for anyone. But it was his scent that hit Archer first. Alpha, but not like Julian's warm cedar and rain. This was something darker, older, pine and smoke and cold iron, like a winter forest after a fire. It was a scent that spoke of power, of decisions made and consequences endured, of a man who had walked through darkness and come out the other side with his teeth still sharp. And his eyes, they were a deep, quiet gray, and when they landed on Archer, on the apron, the wet hands, the bucket still visible across the floor, something moved through them. Not pity. Something harder than pity and gentler at the same time. "Good morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a rumble that seemed to resonate in Archer's chest. "I'm looking for the Vance family. They're upstairs," Archer managed. He could feel his own scent spiking. Fear, confusion, something else he didn't want to name. "May I ask who's calling?" The man looked at him for one moment longer. "Marcus," he said. "I'm Julian's uncle." Behind him, Archer heard a sound he had never heard before in all his 3 years in that house. He heard Catherine Vance gasp. He turned. The whole family was frozen on the staircase. Catherine's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. Camilla had gone the color of paper. And Julian finally looked up from his phone, and every drop of blood drained from his face. "Uncle Marcus." Julian's voice cracked on the second word. We didn't know you were coming. We would have prepared. I imagine you would have." Marcus stepped past Archer into the foyer, and the very air in the great house seemed to change. The temperature dropped. The light in the chandeliers seemed to dim. His gaze swept the enormous room, the marble, the paintings, the family arranged on the stairs like nervous birds, and then it came back and settled on Archer. "And who," he said quietly, "is this?" There was a silence. Catherine recovered first, arranging her face into its social smile. "Oh, that's no one really. Well, that's the boy Julian married. Archer. He helps around the house." "He helps around the house," Marcus repeated. He looked at the apron, at the bucket across the room, the gray water still in it, at Archer's reddened hands. And when he spoke again, his voice had not risen at all. It had gone quieter. And somehow that was worse. "You are telling me," he said, "that the Omega of my nephew, a man who carries this family's name, was on his knees scrubbing your floor when I arrived?" The smile fell off Catherine's face. "It's not. He likes to keep busy." "He offered," Camilla said quickly. "Do not," Marcus said, "lie to me in my own family's house." He did not shout. He never once raised his voice through the whole terrible silence that followed. He simply turned slowly and looked at Archer, who was standing frozen in the middle of the foyer with a wet apron and no idea in the world what was happening. "Take off that apron," he said gently. Archer's hands trembled. He did not move. "Please," Marcus said, and the word was softer than anything Archer had heard in that house in 3 years. "You will never wear it again. Take it off, Archer, and get up. I mean this for the rest of your life. You will never kneel in this house again." Archer did not understand why his eyes were suddenly burning. He reached back and untied the apron, and he let it fall to the marble floor. From the top of the stairs, Catherine Vance watched it fall, and understood before anyone else did that everything was about to change. Marcus turned to Julian. "Come down here." Julian came down the stairs like a man walking to the edge of a cliff. He was 34 years old, an alpha, a man who had never been afraid of anything in his life, and he looked in that moment like a frightened boy. "Look at your Omega," Marcus said. Julian looked at the floor. "I said look at him." Julian lifted his eyes to Archer. And for one moment, one single aching moment, Archer saw a flicker of the man he had married. Shame, real shame, twisting his handsome face. But then it was gone, buried under 3 years of cowardice, and he looked away again. Marcus nodded slowly, as though something had been confirmed that he had already suspected. "I'm going to tell you something," he said to the whole family, "and I am only going to say it once. My brother built the respectable part of this family, the restaurants, the buildings, the name you all live so comfortably behind. But before that, there was me. I built the part no one talks about. I am the reason this family has money at all. And I did not spend 40 years building something, so that his widow and his children could turn it into a house, where a good Omega is made to kneel on the floor for sport." He let the word settle. "Archer," he said without turning around. "Pack a bag. A small one. You're leaving with me." The room erupted. "You can't take his Omega," Catherine cried. "He's married." "Archer is a grown man," Marcus said, and now there was iron under the quiet. "I am offering. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference." He turned to Archer at last. "You may stay here, and I will make certain it never happens again. Or you may come and stay in my home, where you will be a guest. Nothing more, nothing less, until you decide what you want your life to be. It is entirely your choice. But I will not walk out that door and leave you scrubbing that floor. That much I will not do." Archer stood in the middle of the marble foyer, 3 years of silence roaring in his ears. He looked at Julian, who was looking at his shoes. He looked at Catherine, whose face had gone from cruel to frightened. And he looked at Marcus, a stranger, a man he had known for 11 minutes, a man his own family called a monster, who was the first person in 3 years to ask him what he wanted. "I'll get my bag," Archer said. The car was quiet and smooth, smelling of leather and something faintly like cedar. Archer sat in the back seat with a single small suitcase on the floor by his feet, holding it steady with his ankle as though it might try to run away. Marcus sat across from him. He had taken off his coat, and in the gray afternoon light through the tinted windows, he looked less like a monster and more like a tired man who had seen too much. "You're frightened," he said. It was not a question. "A little," Archer admitted. Then, because 3 years of biting his tongue had built up a great deal of pressure, he said more than he meant to. "I don't know you. Your own family is terrified of you. I heard your niece call you a monster once. And now I'm in a car with you, and I don't even know where we're going." He expected Marcus to be angry. Instead, the older alpha almost smiled. It changed his whole face, softening the hard lines around his mouth and eyes. "That's the smartest thing anyone said to me all day," he said. "Good. You should ask. An Omega who stops asking questions is an Omega who's given up. And you haven't given up. I could see that the moment you opened the door. You could see that? I was on my knees." "You were on your knees," Marcus said quietly. "And your back was straight. People who have truly surrendered slump. You didn't slump." He looked out the window. "My niece is right, in a way. I have done things in my life that I will answer for someday. I built this family's fortune out of a world I would not wish on anyone. But I'll tell you the one thing I have never done, Archer. Not once in 58 years. I have never made a good person small so that I could feel large. My brother's family does it before breakfast. That is the difference between me and them. And it is the only difference that has ever mattered to me." Archer was quiet for a long moment. "Where are we going?" "My home is outside the city. On the water. It's quiet." Marcus glanced at him. "You'll have your own rooms. A door that locks from the inside. Your side, not mine. Alara, my housekeeper, has been with me 30 years, and she will fuss over you until you beg her to stop. You'll eat well. You'll sleep. And when you feel like a human being again, and you will, it takes about 2 weeks in my experience. Then we'll talk about what you want to do." "Why?" The word came out cracked. "Why would you do this for me? You don't know me." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. When he answered, his voice had lost its steadiness for just a breath. "Because 40 years ago," he said, "there was an Omega in my life who was treated the way you were treated in that house this morning. And I told myself I would fix it later. I told myself there was time." He turned back to the window. "There wasn't. So I don't do things later anymore. That's all." Archer did not ask who the Omega had been, but he noticed that Marcus's hands, folded on his knee, were very still, the stillness of a man holding something in. And he noticed too that some knot in his own chest that had been pulled tight for 3 years had loosened just slightly for the first time. Outside the windows, the gray city gave way to green, and then to the wide flat shine of the water. The house was not what Archer expected. He had braced himself for something like the Vance estate, cold marble and cruel chandeliers. But Marcus's house was long and low, made of stone and old wood, wrapped on 3 sides by the water, with big windows that let the gray-gold light pour in. There were bookshelves, worn armchairs that looked like they were actually meant to be sat in, a fireplace that was lit, and a kitchen that smelled like rosemary and something baking. And there was Alara. She was a small, round Omega woman of perhaps 70, with iron-gray hair in a bun and the sharpest, kindest eyes Archer had ever seen. She took one look at Archer's face, at the exhaustion in it, the reddened hands, the small brave suitcase, and her whole expression folded into something fierce and tender at once. "Oh, you poor lamb," Alara said, and she took his suitcase right out of his hand before he could stop her. "Marcus, what have they done to this boy?" "Exactly what you think," Marcus said quietly. Alara said something under her breath in a language Archer didn't know, but the tone made it very clear it was not a blessing on the Vance family. "You come with me," Alara said, taking Archer's arm. "You're skin and bone. When did you last eat a proper meal? And I don't mean whatever they let you have. I mean sat down at a table like a person. Archer tried to remember. He genuinely could not. Alara made a sound of pure outrage and towed him toward the kitchen. That first evening set the shape of the days that followed. Alara fed him thick soup, warm bread, roast chicken, things that tasted like his own mother's cooking from long ago. She clucked over him and made up a room with windows over the water and a door that locked from the inside, exactly as Marcus had promised. And Marcus, for the most part, left him alone. That was the thing that surprised Archer most. He had braced himself somewhere deep down for a price. In his experience, when an alpha did something for an omega, he expected something back. But Marcus asked for nothing. He was at dinner each night, and he was courteous, and he told a story now and then to fill the quiet, about the house, about the water, about Alara's 30 years of bullying him into eating his vegetables. But he never once let his eyes rest on Archer the way Alpha's eyes had rested on him before. He never once touched him. He treated him exactly as he had said he would, like a guest, like a grown man, like a person. By the end of the first week, Archer had slept 8 full hours a night for the first time in 3 years. By the end of the second week, he had begun to laugh again, small, startled laughs, the kind that surprise a person by escaping. And he had begun, without quite meaning to look forward to dinner. It happened over the roast chicken on the 9th evening. Archer had been quiet, pushing the food around his plate, and finally he set down his fork. "May I ask you something?" "You may always ask me something," Marcus said. "I've told you. It's the questions that keep a person alive." "Julian," Archer said, and he watched Marcus's face when he said the name. "Do you think, has he called? Has anyone called? Are they even looking for me?" Marcus set down his own fork very carefully. "They've called. Catherine's called 4 times. Julian once." Archer's heart did something complicated. "What did they say?" "Catherine wanted to know when you were coming back to do I believe her phrase was, the household duties." His jaw tightened. "Camilla apparently has a dinner party this weekend, and is very put out that there's no one to prepare it." Archer let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "And Julian?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Julian asked whether you were all right." The kitchen was very still. "He asked whether I was all right," Archer repeated slowly. "But he didn't come." "No," Marcus said. "He didn't come." Archer looked down at his plate. To his own surprise, the tears that came were not for himself. They were for the boy he had been 3 years ago, the caterer's assistant carrying trays of little pastries, who had followed an alpha into a kitchen and let himself believe. "I used to think," he said, "that if I was just good enough, just patient enough, just kind enough, that one day he would stand up for me. That one day he would come down those stairs and take the bucket out of my hands and tell them all to stop." He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. "I built my whole life around waiting for an alpha to become brave. And he never did. And this morning, 9 mornings ago now, a stranger did it in 11 minutes. Marcus did not reach for his hand. He did not offer easy comfort. He simply looked at Archer with those quiet gray eyes and said the truest thing anyone had said to him in 3 years. "It was never your job to make him brave, Archer. An alpha's courage is his own to find or his own to lose. You cannot love it into someone. God knows enough omegas have tried and buried themselves doing it." He paused. "You weren't waiting for him to become brave. You were waiting for permission to stop apologizing for existing. And I'll tell you something. You never needed anyone's permission for that. Not his. Not mine. It was always yours to take." Archer stared at him. Something shifted in his chest, something that had been broken for a very long time, quietly setting itself right. "You keep saying things like that," he whispered. "Like what?" Like you actually see me. Archer's voice cracked. Do you have any idea how long it's been since someone looked at me and saw a person and not a chore, or a mistake, or a thing to be corrected? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. About the same length of time, he said finally, since anyone looked at me and saw anything but a monster. They sat there, the two of them, in the warm kitchen with the water dark and shining outside the windows. And Archer understood something he had not understood before. They were both of them people the world had decided to see only one way. And they were both of them wrong about each other in exactly the same hopeful direction. The days grew into weeks, and the weeks began to feel cautiously like a life. Archer started cooking again, not because anyone made him, but because he wanted to. Because the kitchen in Marcus's house was warm and bright, and his to use freely. Because cooking had once been the thing that made him feel most like himself. He made the bread his mother used to make on Sundays, filling the house with the scent of it. The first time Marcus came home to that smell, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and simply breathed it in. For a moment his hard face went very young and very far away. His mother used to bake bread, he said quietly. A long time ago, before all of this. Would you like some? Archer asked. Yes. Marcus's voice was rough. And then, more quietly. Thank you. It's been 50 years since anyone baked bread in a house I lived in. He sat at the counter and ate 2 thick slices with butter. Alara, coming in and finding him there, put both hands to her cheeks in genuine astonishment. Marcus, she said, you're eating carbohydrates. Willingly. I've been trying to get you to eat bread for 30 years. Alara, he said gravely, you have been trying to get me to eat kale for 30 years. There is a difference. Archer laughed, a real laugh from somewhere deep, and Marcus looked up at the sound of it. Something in his gray eyes went soft and warm in a way Archer hadn't seen before. He looked away quickly, but Archer had seen it, and he was surprised to find that his own heart had answered it. Alara cornered him in the garden the next afternoon. She had a way of cornering a person, appear with a basket of herbs or a pair of shears, and start talking about ordinary things, and then when your guard was down, say the real thing. You know, Alara said, nipping a sprig of rosemary. I've worked for that man for 30 years, and in all that time, I have seen him bring exactly 2 omegas into this house. Archer kept his eyes on the tomatoes. Oh, the first was 39 years ago, before my time, but the oldest staff still spoke of it when I came. His name was Raphael. He was the great love of Marcus's life. And he died, Archer. He died young and badly, and it broke something in Marcus that never came back. He built this whole family's fortune afterward, in the years after Raphael. Some alphas, when their heart breaks, they turn to God. Marcus turned to money and to power. And he got very good at both. And he got very hard doing it. That is why they call him what they call him. Archer had gone very still. And the second omega? Alara looked at him with those sharp, kind eyes. The second omega is standing in my garden holding a tomato, and he has made that man eat bread and laugh at dinner and come home early 3 nights this week, which he has not done in 30 years. She set down her shears. I'm an old omega, and I'll say what an old omega gets to say. That man out there has spent 40 years being a monster because it hurt too much to be anything else. And you have spent 3 years being a doormat because it seemed safer than being a person. And somehow the two of you have started making each other into what you were before the world got hold of you. She patted his cheek. So don't you go being frightened of it. You've both been frightened long enough. Archer's throat was tight. I'm still married to a coward who let me scrub floors. Alara said flatly, that is not a marriage. That is a hostage situation with a wedding ring. She picked her shears back up. But I'll say no more. You're a grown Omega. God knows it's about time somebody let you be one. The reckoning came on a Thursday. Archer was in the garden with Alara when the black car came up the drive. Not Marcus's car, a different one. It stopped and Julian got out. Archer's whole body went cold. Julian looked terrible, thinner, grayer, as though the 3 weeks since Archer had left had aged him 3 years. He came toward him across the lawn, and Alara, without a word, moved to stand between them until Archer touched her arm. It's all right, Archer said quietly. I'll talk to him. I'll be right inside, Alara said. And she went, but she left the kitchen door open, and Archer knew she'd be watching from behind it. For a long moment, Julian just looked at him, at his face, which had color in it again, at his hands, which had healed, at the way he stood with his back straight and his chin level. You look well, Julian said. His voice cracked. You look like you did when I met you. I feel like it too, Archer said. For the first time in 3 years. Julian flinched. He stopped, started again. I came to bring you home. This is my home now, Julian. You're my Omega? Am I? Archer said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. When did I last feel like your Omega, Julian? When your mother handed me a bucket. When your sister called me the help in front of guests. When you sat at the top of those stairs and told me I missed a spot. He shook his head slowly. I waited 3 years for you to become the alpha I married. I want you to know that I don't blame you for not becoming him. I've learned some things these past weeks. You can't make courage grow in someone by watering it with your own patience. I know that now. I finally know that. I was afraid, Julian said. And it was at last the truth. Archer could see it. You don't understand my family. My father was afraid of them. I grew up watching him be afraid. It's all I know how to be. I do understand, Archer said gently. That's the terrible part, Julian. I understand completely. Your family taught you that love is something you have to earn by staying small and staying quiet. They taught you the same lesson they tried to teach me. The difference is that I got out. He looked at Julian with something that was almost tenderness and almost grief. And you're still on those stairs. Julian's eyes filled. It's him, isn't it? Uncle Marcus. There's something between you. There's nothing improper between us, Archer said. He has never once so much as touched my hand. Do you understand me? For 3 weeks I have lived in a house with an alpha everyone calls a monster, and he has treated me with more respect and more decency than your entire family showed me in 3 years. And you know what that taught me, Julian? It taught me that respect isn't complicated. It isn't rare. It isn't something an Omega has to earn on his knees. It's just a decision a decent person makes. Your uncle made it in 11 minutes. And you couldn't make it in 3 years. He's told you the truth, Marcus said. He had come out of the house, quiet as ever, and stood a little apart. His gray eyes were on his nephew. Nothing has happened between us that you could hold against him in any court or any church, Marcus said. I want you to hear that clearly, Julian. And I want you to carry it back to your mother, because I know she'll ask. This Omega has done nothing wrong. He was wronged every single day for 3 years in the house my brother left behind. And not one of you lifted a finger. He's my Omega, Julian said, but it came out weak now, pleading. Then you should have acted like his alpha, Marcus said. An alpha doesn't get to keep the title after he's abandoned the work. He stepped closer, and his voice dropped. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen now, and you're going to listen. You're going to go home. You're going to tell your mother that Archer is under my protection, and she knows what that means, even if you don't. There will be no more phone calls asking when he's coming back to scrub floors. There will be no lawyers sent to frighten him. If Archer wants a divorce, you will give it to him cleanly and generously. And you will thank God I'm letting you off that easy. And if any member of that family so much as says his name unkindly again." He paused, and the silence was more frightening than any threat. "They'll answer to me. And I am not my brother, Julian. I was never afraid of them. They were always afraid of me. There's a reason for that." Julian had gone pale. He looked at Archer one last time. "Do you love him?" he asked. It was barely a whisper. Archer was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Marcus standing there in the gold afternoon light. This hard old alpha who had knelt in front of nothing and no one in 50 years, but had somehow gently helped him back onto his feet. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know he's the first alpha in a very long time who made me feel like it might be safe to find out." He turned back to Julian. "And I know that I stopped loving you a long time before I left. I just didn't have anywhere to put the truth. I do now." Julian nodded slowly. Something in him, some last thread, seemed to break and to settle. "I'll have the papers drawn up," he said quietly. "Clean and generous." Like he said. He looked at his uncle. "For what it's worth, thank you. For doing what I couldn't." He turned to Archer. "You deserved better than us. All of us. I'm sorry it took a monster to prove it." And he got in his car and drove away. Archer watched the dust settle on the long drive and felt 3 years lift off his shoulders and float away on the water breeze. That night, they sat on the terrace over the water. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I'm sorry," Marcus said finally, "that he came, that you had to face him." "I'm not," Archer said. "I needed to. I needed to stand up in front of him with my back straight and finish it." He wrapped his hands around his cup of tea. "I've spent 3 years being spoken about. It felt very strange to finally speak." "You spoke well," Marcus said. "Better than I did. And I've had 50 years of practice." Archer laughed softly. Then he grew serious. "Alara told me about Raphael." Marcus went very still. "Did she?" he said. "She said Raphael was the great love of your life. That he died young. That it broke something in you." Marcus looked out at the dark water for a long moment. "Raphael Delgado," he said at last, and just saying the name seemed to cost him something. "I was 19. He was 18. His father worked for my father. And my father was not a kind man. He was worse than Catherine. He was worse than all of them. And Raphael's family had nothing. And my father used that. He worked them like animals. He humiliated them. And when I was young and stupid and in love, I told Raphael, wait till I'm older. Wait until I have power of my own. Then I'll fix it. Then I'll take you away from all of it. Just wait." Archer's heart had begun to ache. "He got sick," Marcus said. "In the winter. It was the cold, and the work, and the poverty my father kept his family in. It could have been treated, if they'd had money, if I'd had money then. But I told myself there was time. I told myself later. When I'm powerful. When I'm strong." His jaw worked. "He died in March. He was 18 years old. And I spent the next 40 years becoming the most powerful, most feared alpha in this city. And do you know what I learned, Archer? I learned that all the power in the world cannot buy back a single day you told someone to wait." Archer's eyes were wet. "That's why you took the apron off me. That first morning. That's why you couldn't leave me on that floor." "You looked like him," Marcus said quietly. "Not your face. Your back. The way you knelt with your back straight. Raphael knelt like that. He never let them break the last of him either." He turned to Archer at last, and his gray eyes were shining. "When I saw you on that marble floor, I heard myself say later one more time, I'll come back for this. I'll fix it another day. And I thought, no, not this time. Not again. I have said later to a good omega one time in my life, and it cost me 40 years and a soul I'll never get back. I will not say it twice." They sat in silence on the terrace over the dark water. "I'm not Raphael," Archer said gently. "I don't want to be a second chance to fix an old grief. If whatever this is real, then I want it to be about me. About Archer, not about a ghost." Marcus looked at him for a long, long moment. "It started as him," he said honestly. "I won't lie to you. The first morning, it was him. But somewhere in these 3 weeks," he shook his head slowly, wonderingly. "Somewhere in these 3 weeks, Archer, you stopped being a debt I owed the past and became you. The Omega who makes bread. The Omega who makes Alara laugh. The Omega who stood on my lawn today with his back straight and finished 3 years of pain in about 4 minutes." His voice roughened. "I have not wanted to come home in 30 years. And now I want to come home. That's not Raphael. Raphael is a grief I carry. You're the first thing in 40 years that has made me want to be alive in the mornings. That's not a ghost." Archer's tears spilled over, but he was smiling. "Well," he said, his voice unsteady, "that's a much better answer than I expected." And Marcus laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, the laugh of a man who had forgotten he was allowed to. He did not kiss Archer that night. He was too much of an old-fashioned alpha for that, with Archer's divorce papers not yet even drawn up. But he took his hand across the little terrace table and held it, and it was the most tender thing that had happened to Archer in longer than he could remember. 2 people the world had decided were only one thing. Both of them, it turned out, so much more. The divorce was clean and generous, exactly as promised. Julian, to his credit, did not fight a single line of it. He signed everything, and through his lawyer he sent Archer one short handwritten note. "You were the best thing that ever came into that house, and we destroyed you for it, because we didn't know how to be around something good. I hope he makes you happy. He's a better man than any of us. And he always was." Archer read it once. Then he folded it. Then he let it go, not with bitterness, but with the quiet relief of an Omega setting down a weight he'd carried too long. The Vance family did not trouble him again. Catherine called Marcus exactly once more, and no one ever knew what he said to her, but she never called again. And word came round through the city's quiet channels that the Vance house had gone very still and very careful, the way houses do when they finally understand they are not, after all, the most powerful thing around. But that is not the part of the story that mattered. The part that mattered happened over the following months. Slowly, the way the best things do, Archer began to build a life. He opened a small bakery in the town near the water, a warm little place with worn wooden tables and the smell of his mother's bread pouring out the door every morning. Marcus had offered to buy him the finest storefront in the city, and Archer had refused. And Marcus had looked at him with something like pride. "Why?" he'd asked. "I can give you anything you want. Why the small one?" "Because I want to build it myself," Archer had said. "You gave me my dignity back, Marcus. Now let me build something with it. That's the whole gift. Don't you see? Not that you saved me, that you set me down on my own 2 feet and let me walk." And Marcus had understood. This hard old alpha who had spent 40 years learning that you cannot buy back the things that matter. He had understood better than anyone. So the bakery was Archer's, and it prospered, because the bread was good, and the Omega behind the counter had a warmth in him that people could feel, the particular warmth of someone who knows exactly what it costs to be treated unkindly and has decided never to pass it on. Alara came every morning for coffee and sat in the corner and bullied the young staff exactly as she bullied Marcus, and everyone adored her. And Marcus came every evening at closing time. He would sit at the little table in the corner while Archer swept up, and he would watch him move around the warm, bright room he had built, and something in his hard, weathered face would go soft and young and unguarded. He was different now. The whole city noticed it. The monster had become, not weak, never weak, but human. An alpha who laughed, who ate bread, who was seen on Sunday mornings walking the water's edge with an omega whose back was very straight and whose face was full of light. He asked Archer to marry him a year and a day after he'd first walked through the doors of the Vance estate and told him to get up off the floor. He did not do it grandly. That was not their way. He did it in the bakery at closing time, at the little table in the corner, while the last light of evening came gold through the windows. He took Archer's flour-dusted hand across the table and looked at him for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Archer, I have spent most of my life being feared. I built an empire on it, and I would trade every bit of it, all 40 years, for the rest of my life at this little table, watching you sweep this floor you're so proud of." He reached into his coat, and there was a ring. But he did not rush to show it. "I told an omega to wait once. It's the great regret of my life, and it always will be. I don't want to make you wait, and I don't want to wait myself. I'm an old alpha, Archer. I don't have 40 years to give you. But every one of the years I do have, I want to give to you. Every single morning I have left, I want to wake up in a house where someone bakes bread." His voice went rough. "Marry me, not to save you. You saved yourself. I only opened the door. Marry me because I love you. And because you're the first person in half a century who ever made me feel like I might not be a monster after all." Archer's eyes filled. "You were never a monster," he said. "You were an alpha who was told wait by life one too many times and got hard so it couldn't happen again. I know something about the shapes we take to survive. I know something about that better than almost anyone." He turned his flour-dusted hand palm up in Marcus's. "You want to know the truth? The first morning, you were a stranger everyone had warned me about. And I looked at you, and I was so tired and so beaten down that I thought, well, if this monster wants to take me away from that house, at least it's a change. That's all I hoped for. A change." He was crying now and smiling. "And instead you gave me my whole self back. You gave me a kitchen. You gave me my back straight and my chin up. You gave me a year of being seen every single day by an alpha who never once asked me to be smaller." He squeezed his hand. "So yes, Marcus. Of course yes. I would be honored to spend every morning you have left baking you bread." Marcus put the ring on his finger. A simple thing, not the vulgar diamond Julian had bound him with, but a plain warm band of old gold that had, Archer would learn later, once belonged to Marcus's mother. The last omega to bake bread in a house he lived in. And then this feared old alpha, this so-called monster, this builder of empires, put his weathered face in his hands at a little corner table in a small bakery by the water, and he wept. Not with grief, for the first time in 40 years, but with something he'd been so sure he would never feel again that he'd almost forgotten its name. Joy. Archer came around the table and held him, and outside the gold light faded on the water, and somewhere a very old debt to an omega named Raphael was at last, in the only way it ever could be, laid gently down to rest. They were married in the spring in a small chapel by the water. The same kind of small chapel where Archer had married Julian so long ago. And yet not the same at all, because this time the little building was full. Alera wept the entire ceremony and was not remotely ashamed of it. The whole town came. It seemed everyone who bought Archer's bread, everyone whose morning had been made a little warmer by the omega behind the counter with the light in his face. And a great many quiet, serious alphas in dark suits came too, men from Marcus's other life. And they looked at the omega marrying their boss, and they saw what he had done to him, how he had unclenched something in him that they had all thought was clenched forever. And one by one, in the receiving line, each of them said the same thing to him in low, respectful voices: "Thank you." The Vance family was not invited, but Julian sent a gift, a beautiful old baker's mixing bowl, hand-thrown, clearly chosen with real thought, and a card that read only, "For your new life. You were always meant for a warm kitchen and someone worthy of you. I'm sorry it wasn't me. I'm sorry for everything." Archer kept the bowl. He used it every single morning for the rest of his life. He was not an Omega who believed in holding on to bitterness. He had spent 3 years being on the receiving end of it, and he knew exactly how heavy it was to carry and how little it was worth. At the wedding dinner, Marcus stood to speak, and the room went quiet the way rooms had always gone quiet for him. But this time, not from fear. "Most of you know the name they call me," he said. "I won't pretend I didn't earn it. I spent 40 years being the hardest alpha in this city because I decided a long time ago that the world had taken something from me and I would never let it take anything again. And I was very good at it. I was so good at it that I forgot there was anything else an alpha could be." He looked down the length of the table to where Archer sat in a simple ivory suit with his mother's warmth in his face and his father's dignity in his straight back. And then a little over a year ago, I walked into a house I hadn't visited in years, and I found a good Omega on his knees scrubbing a floor. And every cruel thing I'd ever seen in my life was in that room. And so was every tender thing I'd ever lost. His voice caught. I told him to get up. I told him he'd never kneel in that house again. I thought I was rescuing him. I've had a year to understand the truth. It was the other way around. That morning on that cold floor, with his back straight and his spirit not yet broken, he rescued me. He just let me carry the bucket out the door so I could feel useful about it. The room laughed and wept all at once. He raised his glass to Archer. "To the Omega who was made small for 3 years by people who should have cherished him, and who will be cherished every single morning he is left by an alpha who finally learned the only lesson that ever mattered. Never say later to something good. Never once." He looked at Archer. "To Archer, my husband." And the whole room rose to its feet. Archer Moreau, Archer Vance now, for he had chosen to keep the name. Not the name he'd suffered under, but the one he had remade. The one that meant second chances and a warm kitchen and a love he had never believed he deserved. Stood among all those people who loved him in a warm room full of light. And understood at last, all the way down to the bottom of his tired and mended heart, the thing his father had told him when he was 9 years old. Your dignity and your kindness. No one can take them from you unless you hand them over. He had come so close to handing them over. For 3 long years, on so many cold mornings, he had nearly given them away. But he hadn't. He had knelt on that marble floor 1,000 mornings with his back straight, holding on to the last of himself, waiting, not for an alpha to become brave, he understood now, but simply for the world to remember he was there. And the world had remembered, in the shape of the last alpha anyone would have guessed. A monster who turned out to be the only one who saw him. He lifted his own glass, and his hand did not tremble, and his voice was clear and warm and carried to every corner of the room. To being seen, he said, it's all any of us ever really wants. Just to be seen, and to be cherished for exactly who we are. He looked at his husband, this good, hard, tender alpha, and smiled the smile of an Omega who has finally, after so very long, come all the way home. It took me 36 years and a floor full of gray water to get here. But I promise you, every single one of you, it was worth the wait. Outside, the spring light lay gold on the water. And inside, In the warm, bright room, an Omega who had once been made to kneel stood tall among people who loved him, holding the hand of the Alpha who had reminded him, and himself, that no one, not ever, gets to decide your worth for you. That is yours. It was always yours.